All right, let's get ready to take a deep dive into the world of Levi ben Gerson, better known as Gersonides.
He's a 14th century thinker, a real intellectual powerhouse. If you're into philosophy, you know this guy was a true polymath.
Astronomy, mathematics, biblical commentary, you name it, he explored it.
But it's his philosophy that really makes him stand out.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to focus on today.
We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide.
So get ready for some seriously in-depth philosophical discussion.
We're talking some big questions here.
Like, can the content of your knowledge actually lead to immortality?
How did Gersonides try to reconcile reason and faith in a universe seemingly governed by the stars?
And did one of his predictions possibly fuel anxieties surrounding the Black Death?
It's going to be a wild ride.
So, to kick things off, let's set the stage. Gersonides was born in 1288 in Provence, France.
A real hub of intellectual activity at the time, Jewish intellectual life was flourishing,
And Gersonides was right in the thick of it,
absorbing ideas from all these different schools of thought.
especially those rooted in Aristotelian philosophy.
But what sets Gersonides apart is his unique approach,
He's a champion of religious rationalism.
which basically means he believed reason was this God-given tool, something we can use to understand faith.
So for him, reason and the Torah, the Jewish religious law, they weren't in conflict.
Right. If you came across an apparent contradiction between logic and a literal interpretation of Scripture, well, it meant you needed to reinterpret.
You got to dig deeper.
Exactly.
So he's not shying away from the tough questions. He's tackling them head on.
Using logic and reason to illuminate the mysteries of faith,
And this approach led him to some pretty radical conclusions.
especially when it came to the question of creation.
Right, this is where he really starts to break away from some of his predecessors.
Like Maimonides, he believed that the question of creation, it was ultimately beyond human comprehension.
Too much for our little brains to grasp.
Our finite minds just couldn't grasp the infinite nature of God and the act of creation. But Gersonides, he wasn't satisfied with leaving it at that.
Ever the rationalist.
Always pushing the boundaries.
He thought, well, maybe we can use reason to understand creation, even if it's on a different level than Maimonides imagined.
And that's where he brings in Plato's Timaeus. He argued that the universe was created out of eternally pre-existing matter.
So he's proposing that the universe wasn't created ex nihilo, out of nothing.
Right, it emerged from something that always existed.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, he introduces these two types of matter. There's Geshem, this primordial, formless, kind of chaotic matter.
Pure potential.
And then there's Homer, which is more in line with Aristotle's idea of prime matter, matter that has the potential for form.
So imagine Geshem as this swirling, undefined potential, and Homer as the clay that gets molded and shaped into the universe as we know it.
That's a great way to put it. And for Gersonides, this wasn't just some abstract philosophical theory.
He thought this view of creation could be demonstrated through logical reasoning,
A pretty bold move at the time.
challenging the status quo,
Definitely. And this sets the stage for a lot of his other groundbreaking ideas,
like his ideas on immortality.
which we'll get into after a quick break.
Stay with us.
Okay, so let's jump into one of Gersonides' most fascinating ideas, immortality.
This is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, and this wasn't just some vague notion of an afterlife for him. He had a very specific, even radical concept of what it meant to achieve immortality.
So, what were the prevailing ideas about immortality at the time? How did Gersonides' view differ?
Well, many of his predecessors, particularly those influenced by Islamic philosophers like Averroes, they subscribed to this idea of the unity of intellect. They believed that all humans shared a single universal intellect.
So it's not that our individual minds continue after death. It's more like we all merge back into this universal pool of consciousness.
Exactly. And while that might sound appealing to some, it didn't sit well with Gersonides. He was a fierce defender of individual identity and the power of the human intellect.
He's pushing back against this idea of a collective afterlife, arguing for something more personal, more individualistic.
Precisely. Gersonides believed that personal immortality was achievable, but not through some mystical ritual or divine intervention. He tied it directly to the content of one's knowledge.
Wait, so you're telling me that what I know determines whether I achieve immortality? That's a pretty high-stakes game of trivia.
Well, it's not just about accumulating facts, it's about the depth and quality of your understanding. Gersonides argued that when the content of your knowledge reflects the rational order of the universe itself, you achieve a state of immortality.
So it's not just about knowing a lot of stuff. It's about understanding the underlying principles, the fundamental laws that govern reality.
Right. He believed that true knowledge, the kind that leads to immortality, is about grasping the intricate web of cause and effect, the interconnectedness of all things. It's about seeing the universe not as this random collection of events, but as a harmonious, rational system.
I can see how this ties back to his religious rationalism. Reason isn't just a tool for understanding the physical world, it's the pathway to a higher spiritual state, even immortality.
Exactly. And this leads us to another big question. If we can achieve immortality through our own intellect, what role does God play in all of this?
Right, because it seems like he's shifting the focus away from divine grace or intervention and putting more emphasis on human agency.
And that's where his ideas on divine knowledge and providence come in. Again, Gersonides isn't afraid to challenge traditional notions, even when it comes to God.
Okay, so how did he reconcile human free will with the idea of a divine plan?
Well, he starts by tackling this concept of divine omniscience. Traditionally, God is seen as knowing everything, past, present, and future. But Gersonides takes a different approach. He argued that God knows particulars, individual things, but only in a general sense, through their species.
So God knows what a human being is, but not necessarily what I'm going to do tomorrow.
Precisely. And he takes this even further, claiming that God doesn't actually have knowledge of future contingents, things that might or might not happen.
That's a bold statement. It almost suggests that even God is bound by the limits of time and possibility.
It's a departure from traditional views for sure. But for Gersonides, this was about preserving human free will. If God already knows everything we're going to do, does that truly leave any room for choice?
It's a real philosophical conundrum.
It is.
But if God's knowledge isn't about specific details, what about providence? Does it even exist in Gersonides' system?
It does, but again with a twist. He believed that providence also operates on a general level, applying to species rather than individuals.
So it's like a gardener tending a garden. They care about the overall health of the plants, but might not intervene in every little detail of their growth.
That's a great analogy. It suggests that God is concerned with the overall well-being of humanity, but doesn't micromanage our individual lives. This leaves space for us to make choices, to exercise our free will, even if those choices have consequences.
I see. But that does raise some tricky questions, like, if God doesn't know the specifics of our future actions, how can we pray for specific outcomes? Or does prayer take on a different meaning in Gersonides' system?
That's a great question, and one that theologians and philosophers have debated for centuries. Gersonides might argue that prayer isn't about asking God for specific favors, but rather about aligning ourselves with the divine will, with the rational order of the universe.
So it's less about, God, please let me win the lottery, and more about, God, help me understand your plan and live a life in accordance with it.
Exactly. It's about seeking wisdom and guidance, not about trying to manipulate God into granting our wishes. And this brings us to another fascinating aspect of Gersonides' thought: his views on astrology.
Here's where things get really interesting. We've got this guy who is deeply committed to reason, yet he's also convinced that celestial bodies can influence events on Earth, including human behavior. How does he square those seemingly contradictory views?
Well, it's important to remember that for medieval thinkers, astrology wasn't seen as some mystical or superstitious practice. It was a respected science based on observation and mathematical calculations. Gersonides saw astrology as a way to understand the interconnectedness of the universe, the idea that everything influences everything else.
So he's not talking about horoscopes and predicting whether you'll meet a tall, dark stranger. He's talking about a more holistic view of how celestial bodies might exert a subtle influence on earthly events.
Right. He distinguishes between natural astrology, which is the idea that celestial bodies affect things like the weather and natural cycles,
Right.
and judicial astrology, which is more about predicting individual fates.
So he's on board with the idea that the stars can influence the tides, but maybe not so much with them dictating whether I'll win the lottery.
Exactly. He acknowledges that the stars might incline us towards certain actions or tendencies, but he also believes that our intellect and choices can override those influences.
So it's not like we're puppets dangling from celestial strings. We have the capacity to resist those influences, to chart our own course.
Precisely. He even suggests that the more we develop our intellect, the better equipped we are to make choices that are truly our own, free from the subtle pull of the stars.
It's fascinating how he tries to weave together these seemingly disparate threads: reason, free will, divine knowledge, and the influence of the cosmos into a coherent worldview. It's complex, challenging, and definitely thought-provoking.
And we're not done yet. We still need to explore how these philosophical ideas translate into his ethical views and his biblical commentary, particularly his work on the Song of Songs.
Okay, I am ready for more. Let's dive into the next layer of Gersonides' thought and see how his ideas on ethics and biblical interpretation round out this philosophical puzzle.
Okay, so we've covered so much ground with Gersonides, his ideas on creation, immortality, divine knowledge, and even astrology. But there's still one piece missing from this puzzle,
Yeah, his ethical philosophy.
and how he approached biblical interpretation.
This is where he really tried to apply those philosophical insights to the realm of human experience, trying to understand, like, what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live a meaningful life?
And he explores these ideas most explicitly in his commentary on the Song of Songs, a text that's often interpreted as this allegory for the love between God and Israel.
Right.
But Gersonides takes a bit of a different approach.
Yeah, he sees the Song of Songs as an allegory for this journey of intellectual and spiritual enlightenment. For him, true happiness, what he calls human felicity, it comes from knowing God.
Okay.
And this knowledge, it's achieved through understanding the natural world and its rational order. So it's not about blind faith or emotional piety. It's about using our reason to grasp those underlying principles of creation, which ultimately lead us closer to the Creator.
Exactly. And this ties back to his emphasis on studying mathematics, physics, astronomy, all those fields he excelled in. He saw them as like stepping stones towards metaphysics.
Towards ultimately union with God.
Right.
It's almost like he's saying that the path to spiritual enlightenment is paved with scientific inquiry. That's a pretty radical idea.
It definitely was in the 14th century. But for Gersonides, there was no conflict between science and religion. He saw them as complementary paths.
Both leading toward a deeper understanding of God and the universe.
Yeah.
But, like, does that mean everyone has to become this philosopher-scientist to achieve true happiness?
Yeah.
What about those who don't have the time or inclination for those kinds of intense intellectual pursuits?
Right, and Gersonides acknowledged that. He knew not everyone could reach that level of intellectual perfection. So for those who couldn't, he emphasized the importance of religious law as a guide for living a moral and fulfilling life. He saw the commandments not as these arbitrary rules, but as practical guidelines. Guidelines for living in harmony with the divine will, with the rational order of the universe.
So there are multiple paths to happiness, but they all involve striving to live in accordance with a higher order, whether that's through intellectual exploration or adhering to religious law.
Yeah. And for Gersonides, both paths ultimately lead to the same goal, a deeper understanding of God and our place in the universe. But even with this optimistic view of human potential, Gersonides wasn't naive. He knew about the challenges we face as humans. I mean, he lived in a time of huge upheaval, political instability, social unrest, and of course, the ever-present threat of disease.
Which brings us back to that infamous prediction we mentioned earlier. Gersonides, the brilliant philosopher and astronomer, also dabbled in prognostication. And one of his predictions coincided with one of the darkest periods in human history, the Black Death.
Yeah, in 1345, just a year before his death, Gersonides predicted that this conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter would bring about extraordinary evil, wars, famines, disease, widespread death.
And, of course, just a few years later, the Black Death swept across Europe, killed millions. It's easy to see how people would connect those two events and see his prediction as this chilling prophecy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it wasn't just the general public. Even the medical faculty of the University of Paris, they cited this conjunction as a possible cause for the plague.
Wow.
So even back then, people were looking to the stars for answers, trying to make sense of the chaos and suffering.
But did Gersonides himself explicitly link his prediction to the Black Death? Did he see it as a confirmation of his astrological calculations?
That's hard to say for sure. He died in 1344 before the plague really hit Europe, so we don't know for sure. But his writings do suggest that he had this deep awareness of the power of the stars to influence human affairs, even if he believed that human choice could sometimes override those influences.
It's a fascinating dilemma. If he had lived to see the Black Death, how would he have reconciled his belief in human agency with this devastating scale of the plague? Would he have seen it as proof of the limits of human control, a stark reminder of the forces beyond our grasp?
It's a question that's really open to interpretation, but I think it speaks to the complexity of Gersonides' thought. His willingness to wrestle with these big existential questions without offering easy answers.
He wasn't afraid to grapple with the paradoxes and uncertainties of human existence,
Hmm.
even when those uncertainties extended to his own predictions.
Yeah.
And maybe that's Gersonides' most enduring legacy, that unwavering commitment to reason, his insatiable curiosity, and his willingness to challenge conventional thinking, even his own.
He was a true maverick, a philosopher ahead of his time. And while some of his ideas might seem strange or even contradictory to us today, they offer this valuable glimpse into the intellectual landscape of 14th century Europe, a time when faith and reason were often intertwined in ways we can only begin to imagine.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Gersonides, let's take a moment to appreciate his intellectual boldness, his willingness to push the boundaries of thought and explore the frontiers of knowledge. And who knows, maybe his ideas, even the ones that seem a little outlandish or controversial, they'll spark a new wave of inquiry, leading to even greater insights and discoveries down the road.
Because ultimately, that's what Gersonides was all about. Asking the big questions, challenging assumptions, and pushing us to expand our understanding of the universe and our place in it.
Well said. And thank you for joining us on this incredible journey into the mind of a true philosophical giant. We hope you've learned something new, gained a fresh perspective, and maybe even been inspired to do a little deep diving of your own.